All right. Okay, well, thank you very much, Kayla, and welcome to this CALN Lunch and Learn. For those of you who don't know that much about us, CALN is a relatively new organization formed in the Carolinas. We're joining North and South Carolina back together after 200 or 300 years. And it's our pleasure to welcome you today. CALN is an organization dedicated to, and the name says it all, the Carolinas Academic Leadership Network. We're all about focusing on academics and serving as a resource for trustees, for school board members across North and South Carolina. And today we have a star-studded panel for you to give us some information, to give us some learning, to teach us about the topic of restorative justice or discipline, maintaining order in the schools. I want to introduce our two speakers today. First of all, Jonathan Butcher. Jonathan Butcher is the Will Skillman Senior Research Fellow in Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation, but he's also done work with the Goldwater Institute. He is a graduate of Furman University and former member of the, or current member of the board of the Charter School District in South Carolina, and has spent a lot of time in South Carolina, but a lot of time around the country where his speaking and writing takes him. We also have with us Max Eden with the Manhattan Institute. Before Manhattan Institute, he was with AEI, and he has published a recent article on safe and orderly schools. So we have a great opportunity to hear from both of these gentlemen now. Want each one of our speakers to give us about 10 or 12 minutes of their remarks, and then we will be following up with some questions and some answers from them. So please take a look at the chat.
Just a reminder to everybody to have your microphones muted unless you're speaking.
Thank you, Kayla, in Mission Control. I also want to report that we have on with us one of the other founders and the director of the CALN organization, and that's my favorite AOC, Amy O. Cook, who for many years was with the John Locke Foundation and now is running CALN. So we're always glad to have her dropping in on these calls. So first of all, I want to recognize Jonathan. Give us 10 or 12 minutes, and then we will hear from Max, and then we'll take some questions. So Jonathan, you recently have written, or actually it's a classic now. A few years ago, with Hans von Spakovsky, the paper legal memorandum, misusing disparate impact to discriminate against students in school discipline. And in this, you cover a lot of territory, but just a great resource that is, I think, as current as the day that you wrote it. So at this time, looking forward to hearing from you. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, Oren, and thank you for having me this morning, or I guess now we're into the afternoon. And I wanted to mention Max has also written a book on this very topic. So I hope that when I'm finished, everyone sticks around because his experience when he was at Manhattan, he's now at AEI, but when he was at Manhattan, he wrote that book, and really a terrific testimony about what it was like for the families that underwent and lived through what happened at Parkland. So so he's got some unique experience. And so while I can't really compare with what I know Max is going to discuss with all that he knows from Parkland, I would say that this is an issue that touches anybody who's got school-age kids. So a couple of weeks ago, here in peaceful Greenville, South Carolina, someone gained access to my kids' school property in the morning when the kids were in class and tried to break through the door and get into the school. Now, this person was on drugs. They were not a student. They didn't have weapons, fortunately, on them. But my daughter came home and said, hey, look, somebody pushed a button, the alarm went off, and we were hiding under our desks, right? And that's every parent's worst nightmare, okay, that your child was not safe at school. So this is something that, while shootings at schools are mercifully rare, when they happen, I mean, they're tragic for those communities, right? And they're everybody's worst nightmare, and nobody wants that Nobody wants to have that happen. And so I'm going to use a couple of terms here, and we're going to talk about policy for a minute, but I want to keep coming back to this idea that ultimately what we are discussing here is about keeping children safe in the classroom. That's what this comes down to. But why has this conversation gotten so convoluted? Why is it so difficult to talk about this issue? Well, it's because that there are those on the radical left who I would argue use terms such as school to prison pipeline, and they use terms such as disparate impact, and they take the ideas of what is called exclusionary discipline, and they've almost weaponized it, right? They've used it as a way to say that if you discipline students who are ethnic minorities more than their peers, you are being racist automatically, regardless of what those students did. And therefore, you are using what is known as disparate impact, which is an idea that really traces itself back to the Civil Rights Act, okay? And you are using it in a way to be unfair to those kids. The evidence shows, however, that when you look at the ratio of students who commit infractions that would be worthy of exclusionary discipline, so that's a fancy way of saying suspension or expulsion. Okay, so we're talking about gang activity, weapons in school, being aggressive with a teacher, being aggressive with someone in your class, committing violence. Okay, when those students commit those acts, the numbers show that children from ethnic minority backgrounds are overrepresented, okay, in those behaviors. That does not mean that it is because they are ethnic minorities, right? There's a much bigger conversation here about the representation of ethnic minorities and single parent families, low income neighborhoods, violence in neighborhoods, and assignment to consistently low performing schools that oftentimes, because of union activity, have teachers with lower levels of experience that mean that sometimes those students have simply been set up to fail. Okay. And so the argument from the other side, though, is that, well, if you have a school in inner city Chicago that suspends more Black students, even if they have a higher enrollment of Black students than white students, that school is being racist, or those teachers are being racist. In addition to the numbers that I just gave you about the ratios of students who commit these actions, the research on this topic for years has tried to show through regression analysis and through other social science mechanisms that the reason these kids are suspended at higher rates is because the teachers are racist, right? They try to take all of the factors involved in a child's life and in a school setting, and they hold them constant and they evaluate them, and they've tried to isolate the idea, okay, that there is racism going on in schools, and that is why that these students are disciplined at higher rates, is because there is racism among the teachers. But let me read to you very quickly from an article that was cited by the Obama administration, who, by the way, believed in disparate impact and tried to make it a national policy that you could not discipline students according to race. But here's one of the studies that they cited, okay? In and of itself, disproportionate representation in school discipline is not sufficient to prove bias. Rather, determinations of bias might be seen as probabilistic, that is, as more alternative hypotheses that might explain disproportionality can be discounted, the greater the likelihood that statistical disparities between groups represent some form of systemic bias. So don't miss that first sentence. Disproportionate representation in school discipline is not sufficient to prove bias. Does that mean that there is no racism out there? No, of course not, right? I mean, we live in an imperfect world. There are 50 million kids in education, or at least in public education in the United States. There are, I mean, the public education employment sector is one of the largest sectors of public employees in the country. There are certainly going to be people who make poor decisions, right? And people who make mistakes. But the idea that there is systemic racism in public schools that is creating a school to prison pipeline, So now I'm connecting all the dots for you, okay? The idea that there is systemic racism creating a school to prison pipeline simply is indefensible. You cannot demonstrate it with sufficient evidence to say that what we have is a system of bias whereby we need to counter it by disciplining students differently based on their race. Okay, so we can't support that. What we do have to see, though, is that there is evidence and research that shows that when you leave violent students, consistently disruptive students in a classroom, and you simply refuse to issue discipline to those students by removing them from their situation, the test scores and the academic achievement of their peers decreases, and the threats to their peers increase. Okay, so when you leave disruptive students in the classroom, their peers are going to do worse. So this doesn't mean that what we should pass are policies that are zero tolerance, that we should immediately say in any case, this student should be expelled, or we should automatically not consider the factors of a particular situation and kick a student out of school. In fact, it means the opposite. And this was from the findings of the 2018 Federal Commission on School Safety. And that is that we do need to consider the factors in every case. We need to look at the what happened in a case of whether it was a fight, whether it was a child who was being disruptive. You need to bring the parents in, make them a part as much as you are able in determining what the repercussions are for a student who has acted out. And that 2018 report was put together when the Department of Education went around the country and held hearings with school leaders and counselors and school safety officers. And they essentially said, what can you tell us about school safety and how to keep classrooms running smoothly and to discipline students? And they got feedback from all different corners. I had the chance to go to one in Alabama. I mean, they were listening to counselors, they were listening to police officers, they were listening to teachers, and there is no single approach that anyone determined is the fireproof, the shore-proof way to solve every situation. However, listening to the school community, determining what should be the ability to bring the parents in and have a conversation about a child's situation is an effective way to mitigate a situation. Now, I'll close with this. Looks like I have maybe 2 minutes left, because a part of the topic here, and the phrase I have not used is the phrase, and I think everyone may have been waiting for this, is the phrase restorative justice, okay? Restorative justice is something that, at least by my research, traces itself back to Minnesota many years ago and the prison system, and it was an approach that they used to try to resolve differences between people who were in prison, and the ultimate aim was to make it so that the individuals could sort of make amends for a crime that they had committed that led to them being incarcerated. Okay, so that's kind of the origins, or at least some of the origins that I've seen of restorative justice. It was meant to be something where someone who was incarcerated would have the chance to, in some cases, confront those who they had committed a crime against, and then they would make restitution for what they had done. In the school system today, restorative justice is being used in a different way that I actually think is very, very harmful to the community. You're taking a student who has perhaps been violent, and you are making them, or I should say it differently, you're taking the victim of whatever that incident was and making them confront their accuser, and the accuser, sometimes their only consequence is perhaps admitting or apologizing verbally in some sort of restorative circle for what they have done, right? This phrase restorative circle, or sometimes it's a talking circle, is used in the restorative justice systems. I know Max will have more to add on that in particular. So this restorative process, while it sounds good, is actually substituting itself for consequences. And it's allowing the student to remain in the classroom. And instead of having that student face consequences, there is some sort of talk therapy that goes on that's supposed to solve the situation. And what it actually does, especially for young children having to confront someone that may have harmed them or attacked them or threatened them, you are subjecting them to perhaps even more trauma, because they know that student who attacked them is not going to be disciplined, and they have to live through or face what was done to them, and they don't know who is on their side anymore. So restorative justice, while it sounds good, I think it has, and I think there is at least anecdotal evidence, if not more, showing that these kind of one-size-fits-all restorative practices do not resolve the issue of what the student did in the school, and it certainly doesn't resolve the bigger question of assigning kids to persistently failing schools, dealing with what kids are bringing to school from non-intact unmarried families and students who come from violent neighborhoods. It doesn't address any of those issues. So I think I got us started here and covered some of the main topics, and happy to answer any questions. I saw there's some comments in the chat about providing some of the papers that I've referenced, and I'm glad to do that. And once Max gets going, I can drop some of those links in the chat. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Max.
Thank you very much. And Max, so glad to have you with us today as well. I noticed in some of the writing you've done, you've both addressed whether or not discipline is disproportionate, and also the effect of discipline. We're often told that discipline may scar a child for life as being held back a grade. All these things that we're told can scar children forever, but it looks like the research doesn't support that. But just looking forward to hearing from you now.
Yeah, no, and thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for participating in it. I'll start with that kind of that wonkish point, and then take a step back and tell kind of a broader story of how I came to this and what I've kind of researched and found, right? So to that point in particular, there's something called a confounding variable, right? Where like two things go together, and if you forget about the second thing, then you think it might be caused by this third thing, right? So it's absolutely true that a kid who gets suspended is more likely to drop out of school. And it's true that a kid who drops out of school is more likely to end up going to prison. So therefore, they argue that getting suspended makes you more likely to go to prison. As it turns out, there's a difference between a kid who gets suspended and a kid who doesn't get suspended, and that difference is behavior. The confounding variable is what is underlying the observations of a kid getting suspended and then dropping out. And so before there were actually studies on this, there was a very compelling, broad statistical narrative about the harm of discipline. The more effectively researchers have been able to try to tease out, like, okay, what's the behavior? What happens
I'm picking up Cassie.
Isn't punished, and they find little to no negative effect. So once you can control for behavior, there's no negative effects. The argument that this is harmful to kids inherently is largely a result of kind of statistical ignorance and not great methodology. But to take the kind of wonkish hat off and put that hat on, I'll just kind of explain kind of how I came to this issue, and as Jonathan previewed a little bit, tell a little bit about the Parkland story and what it means for the country, right? So I'm a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute now. I was at the Manhattan Institute before that. I was at AEI before that. So I've been researching education policy for my entire professional career. And sometimes people say, well, what exactly qualifies you to do this? Have you ever been a teacher? And my answer is always kind of unabashedly no. I've never been a teacher, but my mom was, and I grew up listening to what was going on in her classroom every single day at dinner. And my mom was a teacher in Cleveland Public Schools for about 15 years, and for the first 12 of those years, she was very highly rated. She was very successful. And in year 13, a new principal comes who wants to implement a more lenient approach to discipline, because this principal is under a directive from his superintendent to prove that he can get behavior under control, and he can prove that by lowering suspensions. So his success metric is lowering suspensions. He's very good at doing this. He does this by telling the teachers, don't send a kid to my office unless there's been a fight. And so prior to that, when a kid got mouthy, or, a pre-fight started to brew, or somebody threw a pencil, or somebody, told my mom some curse word, she could send him to the office, he'd be punished. My mom had authority. When that stopped happening, when the kids realized, oh, if I don't hit a kid, I'm fine. My mom lost control and her career spiraled, the classroom spiraled, and the principal was massively successful. So the first thing that I wanted to do when I came to Manhattan Institute was figure out like how unusual is my mom's story. It doesn't seem like it would be that unusual, but all of the evidence that had been really out and talked about at the time looked only at the suspensions, which is, as I alluded to earlier, a totally corrupted variable, right? It's very, very easy to lower suspensions. You can either not punish kids who are misbehaving, or you can punish them and not record it. And we have seen many examples of both in school districts across the country. So I start looking for evidence that is reliable, right? Is there data on academics? At that point, there isn't. Now there is, and it's bad. We can maybe circle back to that in the question and answer. Is there data from student climate surveys and teacher surveys? As it turns out, yeah, there was. And I collected it, and it was basically uniformly directionally bad. You would see these policies implemented. You would see higher percentage of students saying that students are disrespectful, higher percentage of students saying there are fights, more teachers saying things are getting worse. And yet this is being constantly touted as a success story because suspensions are going down. And I keep on asking around the advocates of these, like I can't find one single school district where this is good, where the data shows that things are good or where it's clearly working. And I was told by several kind of people in the progressive education advocacy community, look at Broward County. That's like where it really started. That is where it's done really well. That was kind of the model for the Obama era policy. So look at Broward. And I kind of put that off to the side, figured I'd get around to it at some point. And then about a week after the Parkland school shooting, I read an article in the Washington Post saying, this is a school district. This is not a case where a student slipped through the cracks and wasn't offered services. The Broward County School District is on the cutting edge of a humane approach to discipline called restorative justice. They don't just punish, they treat the underlying thing. The story with this kid must have been that he was, just the edge case of somebody who absolutely could not be helped. But there were other articles that quoted students saying, we knew that he would do this. Like we knew it was him while it was happening before we saw him. He threatened to kill us. He threatened to rape our families. He brought bullets to school. He brought knives to school. He assaulted us. He brought dead animals to school. Like we saw something, we said something, and they did absolutely nothing about it. And I thought, oh, that's a pattern that I've heard before. In a school district that I've been told is doing this particularly well. Like maybe there is some connection. And very long story, longer story than I have short. I end up connecting with one of the fathers of the victims, Andrew Pollack. We team up to do a lot of interviews to try to understand everything we can about the shooter's trajectory through the school district. And the ultimate answer to the question is yes, this policy played a pretty profound role in how the student was handled, right? Because when he was in middle school, his behavior was so egregious that this is before these policies were implemented, he was being suspended literally every other day. He was gone for about half of his 7th grade year because every day he was back, he would do something that would get him kicked out again. And I'm not saying that's the right approach either. He needed to go to a specialized school where he did for a while. And then as soon as he started behaving reasonably, he was put back into a traditional public high school with these policies in place. And when he's in high school, the narrative that I got from students and teachers was the same narrative that I saw recorded in the administrative record around him in middle school. But his administrative record in high school was virtually non-existent. He was suspended in his first full year there only once. And that was on a day when his traditional assistant principal was absent. So it became very clear to me that one element of what have gone wrong with him was that it was a student who was exhibiting extreme behavior that in a healthier system would have been documented and dealt with, but in this system was not documented and therefore was not dealt with. And so one concern I raised at the time, and it's frankly been borne out since, is that when you put a pressure on principals in particular to lower, the indicators of disorder in their schools, to lower suspensions, lower expulsions, lower school resource officer referrals, they'll do that by not doing their jobs properly. And this is something that we have unfortunately seen again and again. We saw it in Oxford, Michigan with the school shooter there, where they apparently willfully refused to report to the school resource officer. We saw it in Newport News, Virginia, where the administrators were told that there was a student with a gun on him, and the administrators decided not to follow up with it, despite an extreme record on that kid's behalf as well. So, it is an argument that I didn't want to be true when I made it, but has been borne out as true over time, is that when you implement these lenient discipline policies, what you're really doing is taking away the ability to track alarming behavior. And the ability to track alarming behavior is extremely useful for those edge cases. But as Jonathan alluded to, the ability to simply, and as my mom's experience apparently really does bear out, the ability to discipline for lower level behavior makes a profound difference in classroom environment. The kids can tell where the line is. And if the announcement is the line is going to be drawn further and further back, and if the implicit reason given for that, sometimes the kids get this explicitly, sometimes they get it implicitly, sometimes it doesn't matter if they get it or not. But the reason is that this teacher in the school is institutionally racist. Well, then you have a massive subsidy for misbehavior. And this is something that when I started doing the research on this, had not yet been borne out by academic studies, has since been borne out by virtually every substantial academic study that has been done on this topic. And so we have a situation where you have a strong policy narrative that Jonathan articulated of we're trying to fight the school to prison pipeline, we're trying to fight institutional bias, we're trying to do a more humane and restorative approach to discipline that yields usually bad, if not disastrous results in practice, but that is then considered to be a victory because the indicator of the problem does go down. The one thing I should add, I think I'm going a little bit far on time here, but the way that these policies were implemented was not really natural. It went from kind of nowhere to everywhere in the span of about 3 or 4 years. And the reason it did that was because the Obama administration kind of used the federal civil rights apparatus to threaten to defund schools that didn't adopt these policies. So schools were told, if you have different rates of discipline by race or ability, which frankly virtually all schools do for reasons that Jonathan articulated, our society is not equitably distributed in a whole bunch of factors, and those will show up in the school. Well, then you have a federal civil rights investigation. We might take away all of your money, but if you'd like for us to not investigate you, you could voluntarily agree to do everything that we ask. And so that is how about a fifth of American schools, serving about a fifth of American students, had their policies changed directly by federal coercion. But in the interim, it changed the conventional wisdom amongst educators. And this is even before the critical race theory, anti-racism, DEI thing really boiled over to the fore. But the general narrative that we need to fight racism, this is a sign of racism, we're good if we're against racism, that has really gotten hold in the conventional wisdom of the education establishment. And so, as a school board member, you all should be very conscious that, what your principals or superintendents might be telling you might not be the whole story. Their assumptions are almost certainly, maybe not too broad a rush. There's a good chance their assumptions are misguided and guided more by the ideological predilections of their peers than by either a hard-nosed look at the data or just the natural flow of information up from teachers, because a lot of times teachers feel kind of isolated and disempowered by these policies. So happy to chat in the questions about anything more kind of practically or programmatically, and just really, really appreciate you all taking the time to talk about this issue.
Thank you so much, Max. We have a few questions in the chat, but I want to ask you, I'll modify a famous lawyer's rule of thumb to if the anecdotes help you,
I'm sorry.
you use the anecdotes. If the research helps you, use the research. If the anecdotes and the research are not helpful to you, pound on the table. It's really interesting to learn from someone like you, Max, who has really gone deep into this research, that the peer-reviewed academic research is proving certain or it has certain findings that seem to be consistent. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, there are exceptions, and like one could nitpick at the exceptions, but the broad trend from I would say from probably 2010 to the present is that, the more effectively these studies assess these questions, as Jonathan said, like the more that the possible role of racism shrinks, sometimes to zero, sometimes just to, a much smaller role, and the more that any plausible harm from discipline shrinks. So there's a, but what is actually within research reports is not always what is expounded in news reports about them frequently. And there's an interesting incentive amongst professors too, because they want their works to gain traction. Certain findings or apparent findings gain traction. So you will see works that say one thing and then are said to say another. But I would say the research is broadly converging on what I think is the common sense interpretation of it.
Thank you. Thank you. Question for Jonathan. Jonathan has researched a lot of topics, but he has a lot of experience also with charter schools. And this may be a research design that has not does not exist in published world, but I wonder if there's any research to show the variability of discipline issues across different types of schools, and particularly different types of public schools. Is there any research that shows that charters do a better job with this, or anything about charters as it relates to discipline?
Yeah. So that's a great question. Charter schools are highly variable. I mean, they're different all over the country. They have different authorizers. They come in different shapes and sizes, which is a feature, not a bug, right? And I would say that it really is going to depend area to area in such a way that I can't say that charters are certainly not immune to the same problems that are afflicting assigned public schools. And I would also say that we see in some places the same kind of radical racial favoritism that you see in assigned public schools in charter schools in some areas as well. So for example, I don't know, some on this call may have seen the video from 2 weeks ago, maybe, about Kip Charter School had a boy playing on the girls basketball team who then, injured a girl on an opposing team. I mean, these are the same kinds of things that we criticize in assigned public schools that are adopting policies that, I'm hoping in as soon as 3 or 5 years, we'll look back and say, what were we thinking, letting boys play on girls' sports like that? But in the same way, the disparate impact issue, it's an issue in charter schools. The issue of radical racial theories being taught in the classroom, it happens in charter schools as well. The advantage here is that charter schools are schools of choice. And if a parent finds that they're not happy there, they can go somewhere else. And so I think that is a while not the only answer, it's an important one, right? It's an important thing for a parent to be able to say, this, very bad thing happened to my child in the school. I'm going to pick them up and I can move them somewhere else. Whereas if you're in an assigned school where they have limited charter schools or where they have limited private school scholarships to go somewhere else, and the parent is stuck with the assigned school, they have, far fewer options. So, this is why the topic of school choice is still so important. And look, I will be I'm one of the first to say that it is a necessary but not sufficient condition for resolving the different problems that we see in the education system. Look, it is school choice is important, but I know it won't solve everything.
The next question, this could be for either one of you. What are some suggested practices, particularly in large school districts that have high populations of minority students, that have been successful and effective? Do you know any districts in the country that do a particularly good job of that? And is there a one-size-fits-all approach, or does it depend on the district? Any idea of any effective policies or good districts are doing a good job in this area?
Max, I have a few thoughts, but go ahead first, and then I'll go ahead for you.
Unfortunately, like, credible success stories are few and far between from my perspective. I've seen very few examples of districts going in a strong way, back towards earlier policies. I would say, just to not lose this note, that I think the single most important thing that a school board member can do as a predicate to figuring out what is the precise policy solution would be to, organize, probably not directly through your superintendent, an anonymous school survey to teachers with open-ended response answers, right? Because all of the information that the superintendent get, that the principals get, is funneled through a system of statistical incentives, and you can find teachers who might say horrible things about what's going on in their classrooms, but all that appears to you is that nobody's been sent to the office. And so in every school district that I've looked at where such a survey has been commissioned, interestingly, they've almost always been commissioned by the teachers' union. So at the local level, do actually have some interest in representing their teachers' interests, is that you can kind of hear horror stories. And so the first thing I would do is to figure out, do I have this problem? To do that, you need to get the pure, unadulterated teacher voice. And then from there, I would just say, any policy that empowers teachers and provides authority and discretion is a step in the right direction. I'm kind of a similar mind with what Jonathan said earlier, which is that, it's not as though zero tolerance is a desirable solution. There's one district in Florida, Indian River, that has gotten very, very calm, and they've done this by cracking down hard on student movement, to the point where you kind of get one bathroom pass a week, from what I've been told. Now, that's not necessarily my preferred approach, but that might be the kind of thing that, based on the data, one would want to explore. But the first thing is to know, like, do I have this problem? And you will not figure out the answer to that question by talking to your superintendent or your principal.
So just a couple of quick points. So when I was a school board member for a private school, we as a board voted to hire school security officers, and we felt it was important for our private school, right? I mean, we are a private school that was meeting in a church, and so you would feel like we're sort of under the radar and wouldn't be an issue. However, there were apartments on either side that had things going on, and so we voted to do that. So that became important for us. So I think that a presence of school security, especially before school and after school, if there is a car with lights in the parking lot, I believe that is an effective way to demonstrate that there is someone there to help keep a school safe. So I think that's one. I think two, there are reasonable things that can be done in a facility that are measures of safety, whether it's a student or not. Okay, so one entry in and out during school hours. Making sure that doors have some sort of alarm on them, so that when they are left open outside of those times, an alarm goes off so somebody knows to come and shut them. Because I believe, Max, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what happened in Uvalde, right? This teacher left a door open, propped it open with something while they went out to do something else. The student came in, was able to get in that door. So it was, Uvalde even had some of these security measures in place, but because of user error, it became a threat. So a door, some simple things with doors, one entries, one way in, one way out is another. I think another is a lock, so that a teacher can lock a door on the inside and it cannot be undone from the outside. There are systems that allow a teacher to do that. And reinforced glass. So those things aren't going to help with student behavior. However, they are things that, as you can think through, those would be things that would help to protect the kids in the classroom, short of a metal detector, right, that every kid's got to walk through, right? There are some other things that can be done. On the side of school discipline, I just believe, in my experience with the charter district in South Carolina, as well as with a private school, that involving parents early and often in a child's behavior as much as possible is important. I realize that there will be cases where you have a child from a family where the parents are non-responsive or don't want to be involved, and those may be the kids that you have the most difficult time with. However, all of that aside, that may then involve help from a counselor and teachers kind of working together to provide some services for that student outside of math and reading. So outside of that, though, when it comes to student discipline, involving the parents early and often, and like as we've talked about a few times here on this zero tolerance thing, I think taking into account the specifics of a situation become important, because I don't think, while there should be some automatic consequences for bringing a gun to school, rape, right, or a violent fight where you have a crowd of kids, beating up one child who then, is victimized. So there should be some automatic things for that. But when it becomes, Mac used a great phrase about lesser infractions or infractions that don't quite measure up to that, but still need to have consistent discipline. I think the specifics of a case need to be taken into consideration. And I think parents need to be involved early and often. And I believe that will help to set a standard for what is expected of student behavior.
Thank you. I know our governor and then our General Assembly here in South Carolina have made it a priority to have a resource officer in every school and step up the availability of counselors. As a fiscal conservative, sometimes that kind of shakes you a bit. You really do we really need to pay for that kind of thing? But if we're talking about kids' safety, we need to make those kinds of things a priority.
Well, Oren, I would just say very quickly to that. Hey, look, I'm as fiscally conservative as they come. However, the amount of money that public schools have coming out of COVID is mind-boggling that they still haven't spent.
Yes.
And so I think for the legislature should make it their responsibility to tell schools to take their unspent COVID money and use it on things such as school resource officers is very reasonable.
Right. And cash balances now are in the districts in South Carolina are amazingly high. Well, a couple of funding questions. One was a funding concern, dollars being withheld by the federal government due to inequality of suspensions. And then a similar question is the district of one of our participants was and is fined annually for not being in compliance. Anyone want to address either of those funding type questions?
I'd like to for a second, and then I'd like to ask a question. So there are a couple of mechanisms. There was the threat of total rescission of funds that was levied by the Obama administration, and that is still being put out there as a specter by the Biden administration. They're doing it in a more subtle and tricky way. And it's actually not entirely clear to me what they're doing, but the threat is still there. Not sure about the actions. There's also a policy, to get wonky, called equity and IDEA, which will force school districts that have different rates of suspension by race when it comes to subgroups of students with disabilities, that if you do, they'll force you to reallocate money for students with disabilities to things that need to go to the root cause of this allegedly disproportionate either discipline or identification. Now, this is a terrible policy for all sorts of reasons, but that is something that I think a lot of school districts are having to do with. If there's and my question, that is what you guys are dealing with. Yeah, I'd like to talk to you guys about that actually. So please follow up with me, because I know that this is happening, but I've not actually spoken to a school district leader who is experiencing it. So Peter, I'd love to follow up with you on this. My hope is that if and when there's a new administration, this is one of the first things on the chopping block. Jonathan and I have been kind of doing our part to make sure it's on the radar of the folks who are planning policy. But yeah, those are the mechanisms that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I would just add, quickly, to my knowledge, there have been threats for ages from Washington to withhold money from either states or districts for something that they do, that a district does, that Washington doesn't like. I've never actually seen this really carried out in such a huge way, certainly not statewide. It may have happened, like Max was saying, there might be some individual areas here, but Washington does this all the time, right? They'll issue a missive and they'll say, if you don't follow this, we're going to withhold your money. And that just sort of gets everybody into compliance. When, the reality is that Washington's they're not really going to do that. Or if they do, they're setting themselves up for a lawsuit that will take likely years to unravel. So I've always found this to be a bit of an empty threat, that it would happen to such an extent that a state would really find itself under duress financially. And so maybe on a district level, there might be individual examples, but I just don't see it. They threatened to do it to California years ago, and of course it never happened.
Yeah, one just additional thing while we're on this, to Peter in particular and to anybody else who's experiencing this IDEA issue. This is the kind of thing that I think there's been no pushback on from a state level, mostly because there isn't the organization to do the pushback. But I think that it's the kind of thing, and I don't know them personally, but my understanding is that state superintendents moving forward of both states are pretty strong. That if there were a critical mass of school board members who were flagging it, if there was some national attention, which I would be happy to provide, not putting any work on Jonathan's plate, but I suspect Jonathan wouldn't mind providing either, you could actually see a state pushing back against this equity and IDEA thing, which will be necessary if and when we can change the policy in the federal level. And frankly, to my understanding, could also change the policy at a state level if it's really put to them and that if they decide to run with it. Because being wonky, they have a threshold that they're required to make for this, a numerical threshold, after which they disqualify you. The Obama administration kind of said to them, your threshold should be about this, and all states have gone to this. But they can change their threshold. They can, to my understanding, actually defang this rule. They'd be courting a fight with the feds. But for Ellen Weaver, for the lady who's recently elected in North Carolina, I think that's a fight they'd like if it were really put to them. So,
And
Peter,
possibly winnable.
yeah. Oh, it's very easily winnable in the court of public opinion. Legally, I can't have an opinion, but I think legally too, from what little I know.
Another question here, just going through some quickly, maybe this will be a speed round. Any sense that violence in public schools in America is increasing, decreasing, staying the same?
Yeah, Max, I mean, I don't know what you've seen. I think all of the indicators are pointing to bad things. I think the rate of kids with mental health issues has gone up since COVID. I think absenteeism, both among teachers and among students, is up since COVID. And I think the incidence of students acting out, just on average that I've seen, has gone up pretty much everywhere since COVID. And so, I don't know that there's been a study that's really pinpointed it back and said, because of the trauma that was experienced by people during the pandemic and the isolation, that has now caused this. That's simply the inference I think that folks have made, that there's been some sort of maladjustment that's taken place as kids have gone back to schools. But I could just say that all the numbers that I've seen, mental health is in a worse shape, absenteeism is in a worse shape, and student behavior is in worse shape, especially coming out of 22, 23.
Max, you had a conversation here in the chat that's worth mentioning, and that is the impact of single parent households, or sometimes what pro-family movement calls broken homes, broken households. And I think you quoted an Education Next article that children from single parent households are, regardless of race, are twice as likely to be disciplined in school. And that they're like, which study do you want to cite there? I think there are probably numerous ones, aren't there, Max? That's
Yeah, no, I was able to find the study. It just wasn't, harder to find things on Google these days.
Yes.
But yeah,
There it is.
but if you're living in a two-parent household, your likely to be in suspension is about 5%, and if you live in a one-parent household or with a guardian, your likely to being suspended is 10 or 14%. And so when you consider, if you want to think about the overall race gap, right, in school discipline, it's about 3 to 1. And if you think about the marriage gap between blacks and whites, it's around 2.5 to 1. So that right there, that single factor explains, I think it's fair to say, most of the issue.
Yes, and I know, Max, we need to let you go for another engagement here soon. Have you got just another minute, or maybe one more minute? One of the last questions, most current questions here, is about mental health, and the question of mental health as a route for decreasing learning performance. The question is, at what point is that slide in mental health a direct result of the failure to provide structure and discipline?
Well,
and this, from their view, the more we sit kids down with therapists, the worse we get as a whole. So.
Yes, and I will have a review coming out today, early next week, of Abigail Schreier's new book called Bad Therapy, which I think should be must reading. Yeah, the Wall Street Journal just had an article by her about it. So there's this vicious cycle that we are falling into, and we've fallen into it before we really understood it. And I think we owe Schreier another debt of gratitude for her work on this, much as we owe her a debt of gratitude for her work on the gender identity issue, wherein the relaxation of discipline leads to behavior problems. The behavior problems lead to a desire to have mental health solutions. The mental health solutions compound the behavior problems. And this is not, an unusual pattern in education policy in general, but it's one that I think is at an early enough stage where, the boat has sailed in blue districts because they're fully bought into the ideas behind this. But I think in more conservative leaning districts, the call for the increasing therapeuticization of childhood can be resisted. And it's definitely an issue that I strongly recommend y'all look at her work for. As Jennifer just put in the chat, she had a great podcast on Joe Rogan. She just is the kind of writer and human being who will say things that you just know are true, and they're true once you hear them, but you might not necessarily have independently come to the quite the same formulations she has. And she has the kind of formulations that aren't ideological, aren't political. I like her a lot personally. She's most certainly not a conservative, right? But she is a common sense, gentle, humane woman who talks about these issues extremely effectively. So I could not recommend kind of her work on this, the Rogan podcast, the Wall Street Journal thing with her hire. And with that, I got to hop to a one, but I'm very grateful for all your time, and I would love to follow up with a couple of the folks you had in the chat. So you have my email.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Max. We'll let you go. But for a minute there, Jonathan, I thought he was talking about Bari Weiss, someone who's not necessarily a card-carrying conservative, but just is very, very practical. Well, I want to give a little commercial here for CALN. This is the Carolina Academic Leadership Network organization. This is one of the benefits of being a part of CALN. If you haven't been to the website, we hope you will go to the website, which is schoolboardleader.com. Sign up for the weekly newsletter, and there will be other resources like this. We will have some in-person meetings and some other webinars with resources and help for you. We're going to be talking to potential candidates for school board to prepare them for running for office. And of course, we'll be providing primers within the communities on issues related to academic excellence in public schools in South Carolina and North Carolina. Jonathan, anything to leave us with? You're always great at summing up.
Well, thank you. And I hope what I provided was helpful. Folks are welcome to contact me as well if they have any questions. I would just add, I think Abigail Schreier's book is a great recommendation for those who are also looking at more information about the importance of two-parent families. There's a book called The Two-Parent Privilege by a professor out of the University of Maryland, also not a conservative by any stretch. However, she comes right out and says it, that the problem that we have today is that kids are being raised not in two-parent households, and that leads to any number of negative outcomes for that child's life. So recommend that. One's actually a pretty short read and very readable. It's only about 200 pages, and even though she's a PhD, it's written so that you can kind of pick it up and get a handle on what's being said about the importance of families.
Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Oh, with
Kayla,
that, sorry, and I know Kayla had something real quick, but the reason I wanted to mention that at the Heritage Foundation, we have model policy that school boards can adopt to help integrate what is called the success sequence into school curriculum. The success sequence, of course, is finish high school, get a job or enter college, and then get married before you have kids. And people who have followed the success sequence, 97% of the millennials that followed the success sequence were not in poverty when they reached their prime working ages. So the research on the value of the success sequence is very important, because if we can give this to young people, give them this information when they are age appropriate, right? End of middle school, into high school, that it makes sense to finish high school, either enter college or enter the workforce, and then get married before you have kids, you're less likely to wind up in poverty. But we have information about that on the Heritage website. So Kayla, sorry for the interruption,
Jonathan,
but wanted to give a plug for
your closing comments there have started the dashboard lighting up with likes and hearts. So Kayla, Mission Control, anything further for us?
Yeah, just wanted to thank you guys. This was such a wonderful event, and to everybody who attended, you guys were very engaged. This was a very exciting meeting. So I know many of you know that we promised you guys Chick-fil-A gift cards to those who attended and registered. We will get that taken care of. I have logged everybody who joined us, and we will send that out later today, over the weekend, or by the latest early next week. So I hope you guys enjoyed our lunch and learn from our very expert guys that we brought in here today. And I hope you guys eat more chicken and just enjoy your weekend. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much. Have a great day and weekend.